A story emerges as the Bible unfolds. In the quiet and simple embrace of ancient pages, we see why the creator and sustainer of life moves towards humanity with grace and love. We are invited to humbly approach the scriptures that reveal the heart of God, a God who loves us and invites us into his story.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is good to be here. My name is Dave. If you haven't had a chance to meet me yet, I am one of the pastors at the Meeting House. I spend a bulk of my time in Dillsburg. I'm the campus pastor at our Dillsburg campus, but anytime I am this way, it's really good to be at Carlisle and just to be a part of this section of our church family. And so I'm excited to continue us in our series this morning. When I was in college, when I look back at my undergraduate experience, one of the highlights that jumps out every time for me is I got a chance to study abroad in Greece and Italy. And the purpose of this trip is we followed the footsteps of the Apostle Paul, an early follower of Jesus who traveled all around the ancient world and was telling people about Jesus, starting churches, sustaining churches, and we got to track some of that journey. And one of my highlights of the time was being in this location. This is in Athens, Greece. That's the Acropolis up there on the top of the hill. Some of the temples that were built to the ancient Greek gods are still there that you can see. And then this little hill here in the corner was the Areopagus, or sometimes called Mars Hill. And this is where some of the intellectual elite of the time, Athens was a hub of philosophy and intellect in the ancient world. They would gather on this hill and debate and discuss ideas together. And this is the place where we read in Acts 17 that Paul found himself on this hill in conversation with some of the philosophers of the day. We read about this in Acts 17, and this is always one of my favorite parts of the New Testament, just because of the Apostle Paul's brilliance in how he connects people to the story of Jesus and how he does that. We're going to read that in a second. But as you can see, I love this image because it allows us to tap into the reality that ancient Greece was an incredibly religious context. There were gods that they worshiped all over the place. And you could almost kind of sense an existential anxiety that was there because they wanted to make sure that there was a temple for every god, that they had every god covered so that if they forgot one, they wouldn't get in trouble. So the Apostle Paul actually noticed a temple that was dedicated to, quote, an unknown God. And it was in that context that Paul saw an entry point to talk about Jesus and the creator God that Jesus revealed. And so I want to read this to us. You should see it on the screen. This is Acts 17, verses 22 to 26. So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. Now notice the foundation and the building block from which the Apostle Paul is going to work to pull them to the one true God of Israel, whom Jesus Christ reveals. This is where Paul goes. He says, this God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about. He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. So he's saying, your gods, they need these puny temples to reside in. The entire cosmos, the entire world is the temple of the God that Jesus reveals. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples. I already read that verse. Let me jump down. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. This is where it's easy to get lost in where I am in this passage, because the wholeness, the completeness, the magnitude of creation, Paul is using language over and over again of everything and every need. He created all the nations through the whole earth. He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. So you see what Paul is doing is he's actually pointing to the fullness, the complexity, the miracle of life in the world to then draw people to one true God that Jesus reveals. And we read, if you go on further, it works. Like there were some people that encountered Paul's ideas of resurrection and just were filled with contempt and wrote him off. But many others resonated. And we read that there were other followers of Jesus that started that day. And I'm reminded that both ancient and modern, there are many people of high intellect who end up deciding to follow Jesus because they just can't get over the wholeness, the fullness, the beauty, the mystery, the miracle of creation. There was a book written last year by Jana Harmon, and it was entitled Atheists Finding God. Subtitle was Unlikely Stories of Conversion to Christianity in the Contemporary West. And you'll notice one of the quotes from her book, she sifts through a lot of the different reasons why rationally different atheists and agnostics, prominent intellectuals, actually converted to Christianity. And it starts with the same building block that Paul was laying down and trying to establish in Acts 17. She writes, the most common was the origin of the cosmos. When you look at the data, it's really hard to explain it by chance. Even very high-level intellectual atheists have had these disruptive experiences to their worldview as they consider the magnitude and the miracle of creation. It's hard to get around the complexity and the beauty and the miracle of life that we observe all around us. And so I wanted to start here because over the last several weeks, we've been in the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1, looking at the creation story. And we've been reading sections or whole sections of chapter 1 of Genesis. And it's worth us in this moment just taking a step back and reminding ourselves of the fullness, the completeness of what God had done in the first 6 days of creation. So this is one helpful way to think about it and remind ourselves of what has taken place in the creation story to this point. In days 1 to 3, God is creating space. There's this chaos of the waters, and the presence of God hovers over that and is bringing order to chaos. And so in days 1 to 3, it's about creating that space, separating light from the dark, separating the waters above and the earth below, and then moving the waters to create land. And so in this, God is establishing different functions of time, of weather, of food to be put into place. And then when we move to days 4 through 6, God is bringing functionaries into those functions or filling that space with the sun, moon, and stars, with the sea creatures and birds, and then, of course, with the humans and the animals. And so in this creating of the space and then the filling of the space, we're reminded of how good and miraculous and mysterious this creation is, that had to have had some origin somewhere of a loving, good God that we believe Jesus reveals perfectly behind this incredible creation. And this creating space and filling space, one helpful way to think about this dynamic is, our family, occasionally we like to play board games. And so when that time comes, I'm not a huge board game person, but every now and then I can be convinced to play a board game. And in our home, typically our living room where we would play that board game, it's also the playroom. And so about every time it's just covered with stuff. So when we decide to play a game, our most recent favorite, the Dude Perfect board game, anyone a fan of that? We enjoy that game. The first step is, okay, where we want to play that game is just disorder and chaos. And so we need to put away the forts that my kids have built. We need to put away the magnetiles. We need to get the dog toys and put them where they go. Usually in that process, there's some sort of a stuffed animal that we discover that our dog has taken and ripped apart. It leads to an emotional breakdown from one of our children. So there's all of this this dynamic of first to create that space to play the game, that actually takes work. And there's a lot of steps to create that space, and then you fill it with the game that you play and the players. That's a little bit of the dynamic of days 1 through 6 of creating space and filling it. And so at this stage of the story, I want to introduce a really, really important word for us. This word is critical in understanding the biblical story. And that word is shalom. This might be familiar to many of us. Shalom is most commonly translated to English as peace, and so we tend to think about peace as, okay, it's a place where there isn't war, there isn't conflict, and certainly that's part of what shalom means. You can't have peace and shalom when there is violence and conflict and war, but that's only scratching the surface. Shalom is this really robust and rich word that means so many different things. It appears 270 times in our Old Testament. The Greek word for shalom appears all throughout the New Testament, so it's a really, really important word. And what we see here is what God is doing is creating a context for shalom. If you guys might remember Daniel Taylor, who was actually a guest at the Meeting House in October. He preached on faith and doubt. You may remember him. He's written really compellingly around this word shalom. He argues that this is actually the primary theme of the Bible, is shalom. And this is the way that Daniel Taylor defines it, that shalom is the state of all things and all people doing what they were created to do. I like how an author, Adam Gustine, defines shalom in a book called Becoming a Just Church. He defines shalom as a state in which nothing is broken and nothing is missing. And because of that state, there is perfect flourishing in life that is happening. There's an interconnectedness where everything is woven together and working together as God has intended, which bring forth life and flourishing. And that's a great way to picture this idea of shalom. I've always, through several different scholars, have grabbed onto this image of picture someone knitting together a scarf or a hat or a glove. And as they use the different yarn and thread, picture 4 different colors of that thread. One color stands for our relationship, proper, right relationship with God. Another strand of that represents proper relationship with ourself, our sense of identity and who we are. The third is our relationship with other human beings, our neighbor. And then the 4th thread is our relationship to creation and being gentle, loving stewards of the created world. And picture all of those threads being woven together into a fabric. And then you begin to tap into what this idea of shalom means. It's when that fabric is woven together and it's sturdy and nothing is falling through the fabric. Now, if one fabric is frayed and broken, any part of that relationship, the whole thing can begin to unravel and fall apart. This is so important to see in the creation story, God constructing shalom, building this fabric. And so we're getting ahead of ourselves, but it's worth noting briefly that in terms of this being a theme throughout the Bible, the construction of shalom in Genesis 1 and 2, the fraying and the breaking down of shalom in Genesis 3 in the fall, which we'll get to, and then God constantly, with everything that God can, trying to reconstruct and bring together shalom, and partnering with his image bearers to do that work. And so this becomes a really, really important theme. So I want us to be thinking about that. Okay, days 1 to 6, all of that is happening and shalom is being constructed and established by God. And then where we're going for the rest of our time this morning is we get into day 7. And so I want to talk a little bit about what this day 7 really means, because there's so much rich theology here that should impact our understanding of the story, our living of the story. And so let me read continue on in the account after day 6 into day 7 of the creation story. This is Genesis 2, 1 through 3. So the creations of the heaven and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the 7th day, God had finished his work of creation. So he rested from all of his work, and God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, because it was a day when he rested from all of his work of creation. So day 7, this moment where the primary work and the bringing out of the cosmos is done and God rests. Now, if we approach the creation story from primarily a materialist scientific place, which we've been discouraging throughout this series, but if primarily the way we're engaging this ancient text and ancient story is through that materialist scientific place, trying to get our scientific questions of the how the earth was created answered, then day 7 is nothing more than fairly inconsequential, right? It's all of the work and the creating and the material happened days 1 to 6, and then day 7 becomes sort of this afterthought. It's a period on the end of a sentence of creation that was already constructed. There's not a whole lot there. Maybe there's a spiritual lesson to take about taking the Sabbath, but really beyond that, there's not a whole lot more thought given to what is going on in day 7. But if we approach the text and read the story theologically, and we're concerned more with the why and not the how, and we see deep spiritual truths woven into this text about who God is, who we are, there's so much here. One of the most renowned Old Testament scholars who's written a ton on Genesis 1 and 2, his name is John Walton. And this is some of how John Walton has talked about day 7 and many, many other biblical scholars. That day 7 is the key to the creation narrative. It's not inconsequential. It is the key to the creation narrative. If we ignore it, we are missing the truth claims of the text. It goes on to say, it, referring to the 7th day, is the true climax without which nothing else would make any sense or have any meaning. That is a very, very strong statement that actually centers day 7 as the center of this whole thing. So what would lead John Walton and many other scholars to say this about day 7? That's what we're going to get into here briefly. And then there's going to be a lot of implications for us. We'll get to that at the end about the implications for both our belief and behavior as followers of Jesus today. So what would lead John Walton to make statements that bold about day 7 and its role in the creation account? It really comes down to understanding this word rest. When we hear that God rested on day 7, again, we're traveling back into the ancient world and we're trying to understand what that word would have meant in that context. And there's two really important things to bring up here. Point number 1 related to rest is in the ancient world, the only place where the deities rested was in a temple. You could say that temples were built and designed to be places of residence for the gods, where they would take up residence within the temple and where they would find rest. And so this is all that was known throughout the ancient world. That's what a temple was. It was a place for divine rest. And many of the other creation accounts, we looked at last week, one of them, the Babylonian creation account, the Enuma Elish, that they often climax at the end in a temple being built for the gods. So in the Enuma Elish, it ends with Marduk creating a temple to reside in. And so temples were places of divine rest. And so what Genesis is doing here is claiming that God is entering his cosmic temple, that this is actually a temple text where Genesis 1 is all about how God is constructing and building a temple for himself to reside in, where his presence would reside in partnership with his image bearers in a context of shalom. This is about the earth and the entire cosmos being a cosmic temple for God. One way to emphasize this point is if you jump ahead in the biblical story into Exodus, under Moses' leadership, the Israelites construct a tabernacle, right? This is to be a place where God's presence would enter in and be there with his people, the nation of Israel. And many scholars notice that the way that Genesis 1 is constructed and the way that Exodus 39:40 is constructed, they have a very similar structure. They use different words, or very similar words, excuse me. And so the Bible is wanting us to note a connection between the creation of the cosmos and the tabernacle, emphasizing that the cosmos was a place for God to enter into and to be fully present and to dwell within the world that God created. So we're going to circle back to that point in a second and why that matters so much, but set aside, okay, rest. Rest happens in temples. And so Genesis 1 is about the God of Israel, whom Jesus reveals, constructing his cosmic temple. So we'll set that to one side. The second really important point to notice about rest is actually what it means. So for us, when we hear the word rest, at least my mind immediately goes to, like, if we're playing word association and I throw out that word rest, you're probably going to say words like napping, or like it's vegging out on the couch. It's ceasing from all work and responsibility and just kind of vegging out and resting or napping, right? It's a break from work and responsibility. But that's not what the word rest was about in its context. So think of it in this way. Throughout the rest of Genesis into Exodus, God is talking about the nation of Israel finding rest in the promised land. Now, that rest does not mean that God is interested in Israel getting to the promised land and just taking an indefinite nap and doing nothing forever. The whole point is to get to the promised land, you have to move through a bunch of obstacles, and once you get there, then you can start again normal daily activities to function in that space. And that's what the word rest really means here, is it's not a ceasing from responsibility and work and kicking back and relaxing. It's actually a very active, it's a very engaged sustaining of what has been created. So think about it in terms of moving into a home. So 2.5 years ago, our family moved back to Pennsylvania, and you've got the what do you call those things? The pods that we used. And they were sitting in the driveway, and you enter the home, there's some final maybe cleaning to get done, and then you move all of your stuff in, and you unpack, and over the next several weeks, there's that work of getting unpacked and getting everything set up in your home. And then once the last box is unpacked and you can put it away, then you enter the rest of being in your home. And that doesn't mean that you do nothing. There's still plenty of ongoing work and maintenance, right? There's stuff to do, to the daily routine of keeping up a household. That's what rest means in this context. Okay, so we've got the word rest. And processing, okay, this is about a temple and God building a cosmic temple to enter into and be present with his image bearers within. And then we've got rest, meaning an active and engaged sustaining of all of creation, not a disengaged ceasing from all of that activity. And so what I want to talk about for the rest of our time together this morning is some of the implications that flow from this understanding of day 7. And there's so much to process here. The first thing I want to note is, especially in thinking about Genesis 1 being about a cosmic temple, that this ought to radically change the way that we think about the biblical story. We need to rethink what the story of God is about if this is true. Because from this place, if we start our story of God in Genesis 1, not with the fall and our brokenness and our sin, but started in Genesis 1 where it needs to be rooted in, it's about this cosmic temple. And then it's about pollution that enters into the temple space, right? Sin and evil enters into that temple space and it pollutes it. Shalom is broken down. It pollutes that temple space. And so the story of God is about God trying to take up residence again within God's cosmic temple. I mean, think about it. So you move ahead. I talked about the tabernacle, right? After the fall and sin and evil has entered into the world, there's this portable sanctuary, the tabernacle, where God wants to be present and reside with his people. And then the nation of Israel builds a temple that was supposed to be the place for God's presence to reside, right? Then Jesus shows up on the scene. And what does the Gospel of John say? John, one of the biographers of Jesus' life, says in John 1 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, or literally tabernacled among us. That God wanted to be present so desperately within this polluted cosmic temple that God entered into human flesh fully. The fullness of God resided in Jesus. And Jesus resided with us. And then the church becomes this context to experience the presence of God and extend the presence of God into the world, into every nook and cranny of creation. And then at the end of the Bible, the scripture ends. You should read it later today if you haven't. Revelation 21:22 is about God entering again fully into his cosmic temple, coming back to an earth where all of the pollution and the sin and the evil has been dealt with. And so now it's a pollution-free temple where God comes again to reside with God's people. This is the story of the Bible. This is radically different than at times the story that we've told within the American church. Many of us, this was the case for me certainly, primarily formed in a story that started in Genesis 3 with our individual sin and brokenness and us needing to do the right things, kind of have the right transaction in prayer or whatever it is to get our individual soul saved to heaven away from this earth. And so it's an individual story about a doomed earth and about getting our souls to heaven when we die. It's a very different story than the one that we're wrestling with this morning, where it's a communal and a cosmic story of a God creating a world of shalom and flourishing and goodness and wholeness and health, and doing everything that God can to mend that shalom back together and reside again fully within God's cosmic temple. So we should be thinking about trying to understand the story more fully. Because when we understand the story more fully and more biblically, this changes the way that we live the story. So think about, and I know we're kind of in this series always jumping ahead and behind, so we're just going to dip our toe in this, but we'll get into this more in coming weeks. Think about the implications this has for the human vocation in the world. That we are to partner with God to be repairers and extenders of shalom. So we look across in the context where we live, where we work, where we play, and whenever we see that fabric fraying or broken, as we look at people's relationship with God, relationship with themselves, relationship with their neighbor, our relationship in graciously and gently stewarding creation, all of that matters. And we're thinking about what it looks like to partner with God to repair shalom. This is Daniel Taylor again, who says, "Seeing the main theme of the story as shalom gives me a lifetime of useful things to do." That is so true. This, in terms of our mission in the world, this opens it up where we can see opportunity to partner with God to move the pollution out of this good cosmic temple that God has created. And there are 100 ways that we can process what that looks like in the context that God has given us to steward. So we should rethink the story, tell ourselves a better and more biblical story, and challenge ourselves to live that story in its fullness. And then lastly, when it comes to This vision of rest where it's active sustaining of the cosmos. It's this engaged posture by God. It reminds me that there's no room for deism in the Christian worldview. Deism is that fancy word for, yes, there is a God who created the world, but right now is distant and disengaged from that world. Right? Sort of the classic image of deism is a watchmaker, where God is a watchmaker who puts together the watch and winds it up and then just hands it off and it runs on its own for all of eternity. And there was that moment of engagement initially, but now God is distant and far away. But with this understanding of Genesis 1 and 2, it's a completely different picture of reminding ourselves that the God of the universe, the God who Jesus reveals perfectly to us, is active. I did not cause the sun to rise this morning. I am in no way, shape, or form orchestrating the transition of the seasons. But we believe that there is a creator God behind all of that. And that should elicit wonder in our lives. That should remind us of a perspective that there is a creator God at the controls of the universe, trying and working as hard as God can to sustain the goodness of creation. Despite the pollution that we still experience day to day, there's that trust and belief that creator God is at the controls. And so as we think about Sabbath, that's important to think about. Right, so the people of God, ancient Israel, and the 10 Commandments, one of those commandments that God gave the people, the nation of Israel, was to keep a Sabbath. You read about that in Exodus 20:8-11. And it was rooted in the fact that God took rest in the creation story. And so what I've been reminded of this week is in terms of living a life of Sabbath and a life of rest, that at the core of that idea is that is a rhythm in my life, a moment each week where I remember that I take my hands off the controls. I take my hand off the wheel. And all of the different ways that I try to provide for myself during the week or control life for myself during the week, of course, not all of that is bad. Much of that is necessary. But there's this moment each week where I'm reminded that there is a God actively sustaining the universe who designed the cosmos from the beginning and is still engaged. And so Sabbath rest becomes, I'm going to let go of the ways that I try to seek provision and control of my life and find rest in the fact that God is in control. That God is behind all that we see, the complexity and the miracle of life on planet Earth. And so as we think about what rest might look like in our lives, let's get back to that basic kind of core understanding from where this Sabbath rhythm flows from. Let's pray. God, may we be reminded of just your hugeness this morning. As the sun rose, we did not cause the sun to rise. As we've experienced the warmth of what feels like spring coming, we are reminded that we have no role to play in that there is a God way above and beyond us who is utterly separate from and different from creation, yet intimately involved in that creation, who is making miracles around us happen day in and day out, so many of which we often pay no attention to. So would you cause us to slow down this morning and remember the majesty of who you are, the ways that you are creator and sustainer of all things. And may we find rest for our weary and our anxious hearts and souls in that truth and that fact this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.